Hi, this is Oak Norton, the Director of Agency-Based Education, a nonprofit organization interested in agency-based solutions to education issues of our day, which is essentially a free will approach to education. And with me today, I've got Connor Boyack. He's the president of the Libertas Institute, a libertarian think tank organization in Utah. And he's the author of a new book that he's published called Passion-Driven Education, How to Use Your Child's Interests to Ignite a Lifelong Love of Learning. Welcome, Connor.
Thanks, Oak, for having me. Appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks for being on with us. So I wanted to talk to Connor about his book. I've known Connor actually for several years now through some mutual interest in education and politics, and so we'll talk a little about a variety of these topics as we go through this interview and hopefully keep things really interesting for our listeners. So, Connor, tell our listeners and everybody just a little about your own childhood educational experience, K-12. You know, what was that like? Were you publicly schooled? I know you're a big advocate now of homeschooling and do that with your kids, and that's kind of what your book is about, kind of the unschooling approach. Tell us, though, a little about your own upbringing and
Sure.
what you experienced.
Sure. So, it's an interesting question, I think, that doesn't come up a lot because I think our background, our history often kind of guides, our future path. And in my case, it was when I was a young child, I lived in San Jose, California, and I actually attended, I believe it was the first Challenger school that was out there. Of course, now they're here in Utah and elsewhere. But I started there, but then we moved to San Diego. I just did public school all the way. Homeschooling was not really a thing where we lived. I don't think my parents were even aware of it. I was on a gifted program. I think they called it GATE, at least in Southern California, but it was an accelerated path for gifted learners. I did that for a few years, and I was a very bright child. But as I got a little bit older, especially into my preteen and teenage years, I really grew to dislike schooling. And that, of course, everyone ties schooling to education, and so I therefore disliked learning and education. I did poorly in many subjects. I cheated often, just because I wanted to get by and get done with it. It was not something that was enjoyable for me. And so my background in education is one of the coercive model that my personality, my interest, I really graded against that coercion, those mandates. And so I did not have a good time in school, and it wasn't until many years later that I finally developed my love of learning.
So let's just touch before we get to your when you would kind of identify when your real education started. Tell me a little about your parents. I think you said they didn't really know much about homeschooling, but did they pick up on that later? What did they ever do homeschooling with you or any of your siblings in any way? What was that?
So I'm the oldest of four boys. All of us did public schooling all the way through. It wasn't until I started having children as the oldest. And then we decided to, after a lot of study, go the homeschooling route that my mom especially, but that my parents started to kind of realize not only the problems with government schools, but the benefits of a more parental involved education style or method. And so my parents, were late to the game. Of course, they supplemented at home really well. My mom especially was very active in parenting and trying to inspire us and nurture and educate. She was a great mother, but from an educational perspective specifically, we just went through school like any quote-unquote, normal kid. So it was a very traditional upbringing school-wise. My parents came from that same background. It's just what you do. And I find that with many parents today, of course, they're just unaware that there are alternatives, and that the alternatives themselves are not these fringe, things that only a few people do, but that there are significant numbers of people flocking to those alternatives because of the problems in the government schools.
Absolutely. College, What did you major in?
So I went to BYU, Brigham Young University in Utah. I graduated in information technology. My background is in web development and online marketing. And it was kind of awkward because it was a brand new major at BYU, and I had already been self-teaching myself. I had made a new career out of it. I was freelancing, making websites, doing graphic design, to the point that when I would go to a lot of these classes, I already knew everything, and yet there I was paying for the privilege of sitting in the class, taking the tests nonetheless so I could, get that piece of paper. Of course, in my profession, I never once had an interview as a web developer where anyone cared about college at all. Looking back, especially for my chosen career before I flipped into politics, I would tell my earlier self to not do it, right? You don't need the debt. You don't need all the money and the wasted time. I could have just gone right into the marketplace and accelerated a lot more quickly. So my educational background was a bit different in that I was kind of learning as a formality, but I was really self-teaching outside of the classroom.
So what drove that passion or interest that actually got you started into self-learning? Did that start in high school when you were kind of bored with public school and you said, I'm really fascinated by this computer stuff? Or was there something that triggered that interest and you just dove into it and then college was kind of like secondary?
So my mom dabbled in politics when I was in high school, and city council and so forth. And so she knew a lot of different people. And in the late 90s, as websites were becoming a thing, I was paid by a friend of hers who was running for the state legislature in California. She had a campaign. She wanted one of these fancy new websites, and I think I was paid like $1,500. And for a 17-year-old kid, I mean, for not a whole lot of work, that was a huge windfall. And so I saw the dollar signs. I saw this brand new market opening up. And so the self-teaching was my own ambition for turning it into a career and building a business and being able to freelance and have that freedom. And so I was motivated initially by profit, right? I'm just new into adulthood. I'm wanting to try and forge my own path, and obviously with the goal in mind of developing a successful career in my chosen field of interest. The learning, it wasn't a task, it wasn't arduous, it wasn't a mandate, it was a joy and discovery and essential. I felt like it was what needed to be done, not as some sort of burden, but just the path towards my goal.
Yeah. So let's just take a quick tangent. Since you've mentioned politics a couple of times, let me ask you a question about your political start, and then we'll get back to the book. At what point did you realize, okay, I'm doing this web development, but I've got this fascination with politics? Was there a particular book or speech or something that woke you up? And what age were you at? Because for me, around age 30, I started to realize that I had this interest in understanding what the Constitution was, because I'd never really been taught it.
Yeah.
And I got a couple of books, and that kind of jump-started me into that area. So what was it that kind of woke you up or got you really deeply involved and then led to you creating the Libertas Institute?
So my senior year of BYU, I think it was 2005, there was a brand new documentary that was just beginning to kind of do some private screenings and such. And it was called America, Freedom to Fascism. And it was developed by a gentleman who's now deceased. His name was Aaron Rousseau. It's basically his attempt to portray how this grand America experiment has imploded on its own footprint, how all the noble ideals and everything have we just have a shell of what America once was. So he interviews a lot of people and shows a lot of examples, and it was for me as a neophyte to a lot of this stuff, it was very eye-opening. And I remember distinctly sitting. It was in the Provo Library in Utah, and where I viewed it with a group. And I remember hearing from one of the talking heads, one of the people who was being interviewed, and this gentleman's name was Ron Paul. And I remember thinking at the time, like, I don't know who that guy is, but he makes a ton of sense. And it was a refreshing take because, I wasn't very political. I didn't really like, political parties and all the corruption and whatever. And I remember it was just a breath of fresh air. And so I picked up a book that was collected, edited group of his speeches he had given in Congress, and I just started devouring that. It developed a love and interest in American history and the Constitution, and everything kind of spiraled there, where one book led to 4 other books, which led to 9 other books I read. It just sparked for me an interest. But now, later in college, especially once I graduated, I had the time and the freedom to just study what I wanted. I wasn't bombarded with all these assignments and essays and things that I had to spend my time and my mental energy on. I had freedom, and I really devoured a lot of literature. And so I started to get a little bit involved as a result of that study, just kind of bouncing around different campaigns and organizations. And Libertas was formed in 2011 here in Utah because I was frustrated that there was no comprehensive watchdog of any sort for liberty. There were groups of, niche issues, education groups and taxpayer groups and so forth. But from my perspective, the government can negatively impact, every one of the thousands of issues that it touches, and felt that we needed a kind of a broader organization to hold the line and defend our freedoms. And so Libertas was born. I was very fortunate to find some early donors, which allowed me to quit my web development job and transition to doing this full time. And in the past, 4 or 5 years, we've been able to grow to the point now having 6 staff, a lot of success, and we're having a ton of fun.
That's awesome. So I think this is a good segue from something you mentioned there, that once you got out of college, you had all this free time and you could study what you chose to. And so let's go into your book, Passion Driven Education, because that's directly related to this concept that you have. So tell our listeners a little about the book and why you decided to write this book.
So I've got 2 children. Currently, they are 7 and 5. And a few years ago, I really got to thinking about my own life and how I can provide, the best opportunities for my children, what every parent wants for their children. And I was disappointed that in my life I had to wait until after school, and not by after, I don't mean like until 3 p.m., in the day. I mean until all of schooling was done in my life, before I could finally get the education that has really benefited my life. In fact, everything that I do now, I only got started after college. And all learning is self-taught, right? The information that we're forcing children to cram and then regurgitate in schooling often is just for naught. They don't value it. They don't see the relevance. They just purge it from their minds. I wanted for my children to provide them a path where they could get a head start way ahead of where I was in my life. Why wait until after college? Why wait until you're an adult? Why not find a way to give children that at a young age where they too can have the time and the freedom? And you say, well, yeah, no, they go to school and then when they come home they got plenty of time on weekends. Well, no, they don't, because they're bombarded with homework. Their mental energy is sapped. They've been quote unquote learning rigorously for hours each day, like they're ready to just be done. Whereas in a system of more freedom where children are kind of at the helm of their own educational experience and they can follow their interests and their path where they want, that path of discovering the world and even self-discovery can start at a much younger age. So passion-driven education is the name of the book, the name of this approach that I've developed. That I didn't invent this. Many other people have done this, especially success. If you look at cases of successful people in our society, whether it's culture, business, or philanthropy or whatever, who dropped out of school and yet are now successful, that's kind of the trigger of like, hey, I need to look into that. Why did they quit school, right? He quit college or he quit high school to go do this, and it's because they found their passion. They wanted to pursue vigorously the thing that they knew was their life purpose or where their talents were. What are we missing out on as a society by making children wait until later in life to then discover what their talents are or have the time and ability to pursue them? I don't want that for my children. So this book is an attempt, or it's really kind of a documentation of my attempt to apply it to a much younger child and allow them to discover that path throughout their childhood.
Yeah, I read your book. I loved it. Wrote a review for it on Amazon, and you step through the problems that I think most people recognize in the public school system with homework and just various elements, the cramming for a test just so you can do well and then forgetting it because it's not relevant to your interest or things of that nature. And then you talk to some of the solutions, and I really liked the section is a little further back in the book where you go into specific examples of, like, well, let's say you have a child that has an interest in dance. How would you structure their educational experience around this? Well, what could you do for math and social studies and science and English and to help develop and nurture their interest instead of just giving them workbooks and things that aren't really directly relevant to their interests.
I share the example this way. Imagine if you drop your child into, Morocco and say, good luck, these people are going to teach you what you need to do, and yet none of them speak English. That child is going to feel frustrated, vulnerable, stressed out. What we're doing in schools today is children are being spoken to in different languages they don't understand. There's the language of science. Okay, we're going to now talk about, mass and acceleration and these abstract ideas that make no sense to you. Oh, we're going to talk to you now in the language of math or the language of history. Every subject has its own distinct language that children are being required to learn. What if instead we spoke to children in a language they already understand, right? If I don't want to drop kick my kid into Morocco, I want to speak to him in English so he can understand and learn and grow. If my children's, let's use just my son as an example, right? He loves Star Wars as one of his passions right now. So what if I spoke to him in the language of Star Wars? What if as I introduced government principles or historical concepts or auto mechanics or technology or whatever issue I wanted to broach with him, what if it was all contextualized and wrapped around Star Wars? That is a language that he understands. He knows all the characters and all the plots and everything else. And when we do this, when we do it in my home, it is fascinating to watch how he just latches on to whatever information I'm giving him. Why? Here's why. I think because I'm helping him make better sense of the world he loves. When I help him understand, how physics works by using ships when they're out in space versus, inside a world where there's gravity and so forth, I'm helping him understand Star Wars, and he loves that. I'm not just sitting him down and saying, hey, I want to talk to you about this concept called gravity. Oh, and, an apple fell on a guy's head hundreds of years ago, and so he thought about it. That's a different language. I use the language that my children already want to understand, that they're already gaining fluency in, and I use those languages to introduce all sorts of other concepts. So when I sit down and say algebra, I don't talk to him about the abstract concept of x or y. I say rather than 2x plus y, maybe it's 2 droids plus y. And just by replacing something that's familiar to him, he's eager to learn it and figure it out. And that's the main idea, is just using a child's individual interests as the opportunity to encumber those interests with all sorts of other information rather than speaking in the language of each individual subject and, we got to get through this. Here's our curriculum and here's what we're going to put you through beginning to end conveyor belt. It's a much more fluid, organic, individualized approach that honors their individual interests. Each child is different. Those interests are always changing. But when we validate their interests and even help them embrace and understand those interests even more, I find, at least, the theory is that it's a very affirming approach that makes them feel honored, respected, and engaged, rather than sitting them down and trying to imprint some societal mold onto them in some batch production that every child should go through. That repudiates the individual. I want to find ways to honor and nurture the individual, and I think, at least theoretically, this is one possible approach to do it.
Okay, so before we get into a transition of how parents can do this, I want to ask you about some parents are probably listening to this going, man, this sounds like a lot of work, because, they might think, well, I homeschool my child and I buy their curriculum, I buy Saxon math curriculum or whatever, the set of curriculum, and they're essentially schooling at home for, their homeschool. And so they might be listening to this going, wow, this is like way more involvement. I don't know that I could do this. Mm-hmm. Can you address that a little bit, and how a parent can approach this from a less intensive time commitment?
Yeah, that's a very important point, because especially for those who homeschool, I speak to homeschooling groups often. They're kind of my main market for a lot of what we do, especially my Tuttle Twins books. And so I understand these people pretty well, I think. And I think characteristic number one of your average homeschool mom is burnout. They're tired, they're stressed, overworked. You're assuming a lot by homeschooling. So definitely don't want to do anything that adds to that burden. And while at first blush it might seem that way to a parent listening to this, that's a lot more work, I think the opposite is true. But here's the distinction. To have it be less work than the alternative, than using an off-the-shelf product or workbook or whatever, you have to make a distinction between formal school type of education versus informal education. Now think of it this way. As adults, we don't necessarily learn by picking up a textbook and reading beginning to end. That can often, be the case if you have a particular desire to learn deeply about a subject. But on average, speaking generally, we learn from all sorts of disparate sources about a variety of things. It's a much more organic, informal process. We have a curiosity, we go Google it. We have our interest piqued about something, we go to an informational event. We want to learn more about a subject that our friend knows about, we ask them. We come across an interesting book, we read it. It's much more informal. Why do we treat children differently? Well, I think it's because we've all been duped into thinking that all children need to know the same things at the same time. And I think the approach that I offer is one that repudiates that, just rejects it outright. Not all children need to know the process of photosynthesis at a certain age. Not all children need to learn long division. In fact, few do. And so if you accept that, and if you embrace the fact that children can learn at different paths, some faster, some slower, and that children should learn in a way that we as adults learn, that we as humans learn, that we shouldn't place children through this fake world of schooling, trying to get them to learn in ways that they don't learn before or after school in their lives, homeschool included, then it really opens up the possibility that learning takes place 24/7, that you don't need to sit down and have a class period in the home. You don't need to do an arbitrary curriculum. You don't need to sit down and force something even in the home, that it can be much more of an organic, informal process. And if you take that approach, what you end up doing as a parent is just training yourself to see learning opportunities in whatever else you're doing. You don't create a separate learning time or school time. You just live your life. You go to events. You have activities in the home. You do service projects. You run errands. And throughout all of those things, you're always trying to pay attention to learning opportunities that you can introduce. More importantly, what's happening is the children are learning anyways. They're observing. They're asking questions. They're reading books that you go get at the library. Learning is happening. We don't need to force it. We don't need to arbitrarily structure it. So what ends up happening, getting back to your question, Oak, is that parents can take more, this sounds wrong, but take more of a back seat, or really kind of in the passenger seat, whereas the child is driving. Parents don't need to be subject matter experts in every individual subject. That, I think, is the worst thing that a homeschooling parent believes, is that they need to teach their child science and math and history and English and everything else. No. As we explain in the book, at least under this approach, a parent is a resource to help the child drive in the right direction, to drive to a destination that will be helpful. But the child is at the wheel, and the parent is just saying, hey, watch out for that roadblock here. Oh, hey, consider this detour that looks interesting. Oh, hey, go fill up with gas. But we're allowing the children to navigate that path on their own, and the parent can step back a little bit and not worry about coordinating everything and providing everything and forcing their children through a curriculum. So I think it takes a little bit of practice. In the book, hopefully there's enough, affirmations and suggestions that can get a parent to that point. But it is a bit of a philosophical even homeschooling parents, which, as you know, too often they end up just schooling in the home. I think it requires a little bit more of a different mindset on the part of a parent, and if that mindset is adopted, it is, I think, a lot less work for the parent than the alternative.
Okay, so how does a parent who's either homeschooling currently with a set curriculum or has children in public school, what's the transition look like for them to bring their child home and get started in this? Because it would be very abrupt, suddenly coming from public school to hey, you have no curriculum in front of you, and what are you going to spend your time on today? And a lot of parents are going to be very concerned. My kid's just going to waste time. They're going to be sitting here watching TV, playing video games, being bored to death because they it's a huge mental shift for the child as well as the parents.
Yep. Yeah, great question. First off, I think the biggest hurdle is not for the child, it's the parent. And I think in that question, not for you, but for those who ask the question, these parents, is fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of missing out, fear of dropping behind, fear of being unsuccessful in the future, fear of missed opportunities in future careers. I think it's just fear. And so that's why parents crave, the standard, the norm, the status quo, the safe, predictable path. And so in the book, I talk a lot about how we need to overcome these fears. You need to have faith. There's really that process for the parent to go through themselves is to really embrace the fact that this is the right path. And obviously in this interview, we don't have time to get into the depth that we do in the book where that is explained a lot more. But if a parent can try and shelve that fear or abate some of the fear and have faith that this is the right path, then yours becomes simply a logistical question, right? Like a parent says, okay, I have faith that this is the right thing I want to do. How do I do it? And I think there's different ways to do it. I will just say up front, I have not had to go through this process because we started this with my children from a young age. But in talking with other families who do transition in this way, what I have found from their input and from reading a lot online of others' experiences is that you do need a transition period if you're going from a highly structured environment to an unstructured environment. And I want to add a cautionary note. Passion-driven education does not say no to all structure. It's not that it's a completely unstructured or unschooling environment. All it means is that the children's interests need to be the engine of the educational path. And if that child decides to go down a certain route where there is some great structured material or curriculum that will help, that's great because that child is interested. They have a seat at the table. They want to do it. It's not anti-structure. It's just anti-coercion or anti-compelling children to learn, certain things at certain times. So that being said, how do we get from this method of high structure to general unstructured environment? And from learning a lot from these parents that have been successful in that transition, you need a period of decompression, or some have called it de-schooling. And what I recommend in the book, based on the input I've been given from a lot of these other observations, is having some sort of, you could even do it as a formula. I think in the book, the general recommendation was for every year of schooling, to do 1 month of deschooling. So let's say you've got a fourth grader that you're taking out of school. You spend a few months, 3-4 months, whatever, in a period of deschooling. And what that means is you basically treat it like a summer vacation. You just do activities, you spend time together, you reconnect with your child, you find out what their curiosities are, you allow them some open-ended, unbounded free time so that they can discover new curiosities that may have been suppressed because they were so rigorously subjected to the information in school. So you have just kind of this open-ended free time that you spend together. But this is also a period of training for the parent to spend time practicing this approach where you can identify a curiosity and say, oh, hey, I've got this idea for writing a short story that's about, Dungeons and Dragons, because that's something you really like. Do you want to work on a short story with me? And then you go through that together, and you just kind of practice little by little, attaching different assignments, different projects, different tasks to the curiosities and the interests that the child has. And then as you go along, you're building confidence in yourself, you're getting used to this approach, you now have more faith in this approach because you've been doing it and you see that they're not just, playing video games all day long. But it gives you a little bit of a time that you can transition and really allow the child's freedom and time, which are the two components needed to identify and then pursue the path that they're interested in it. And so, there's no scientific formula. I mean, different families will have different experiences, but I think generally speaking, a transition like that will help both the child and the parent learn and get used to this new approach where they're kind of going to discover their own path together rather than having an off-the-shelf path given to them that they just follow.
Yeah. So one of the examples you gave in the book was of this girl that, her parents were somewhat panicked that she spent all her time learning Disney facts. And, they were very worried. And as it turned out, she grew up, graduated, they worried more, and she winds up with a job at Disney and starts moving up the ladder there. And I think that's a fascinating example or a great example of someone who is doing something they enjoy. I don't know what percentage of the population is in jobs that they don't enjoy because they graduated from high school. They didn't necessarily know what their real passions and interests were. They go to college. They major in something. Maybe they switched their major because they weren't even sure that was the one they wanted to be in. They graduate in it, and they go into a job without really a full understanding of what that job might entail.
Yeah.
And they do it for years and years, and often, struggling with what should I do with my life.
Right.
And so this approach, I think, is a great way for kids to figure that out early on and to pursue things deeply. But here's another question. How do you expose children to the range of career opportunities if they only really see a handful of interests as they grow up? Because there's a huge, global world out there of such a wide variety of things people can do. So how, as a passion-driven education homeschooler, how do you sort of access that range to expose your kids to those opportunities so that they have an idea of what they want to do?
Absolutely. Like I put in the book and wanted to make very clear that this approach, which admittedly is a little bit more on the unschooling side of the spectrum, unschooling is not unparenting, right? It does not mean that the parent just sits there and twiddles their thumbs and does nothing. Here, I'll give you my specific example for what I intend to do as my children mature. I am going to be heavily involved in exposing them to apprentice and internship opportunities, job shadowing, leveraging my network for their benefit. Like, oh, hey, our neighbor down the road is a carpenter. Let's have you tag along with him for a couple of days, and you can see how that goes. And this guy that goes to our church is an accountant, and you really like numbers. Do you want to go talk to him and spend an afternoon over there? And oh, hey, they've got an apprentice opportunity in this manufacturing store. Do you want to? Let's set you up over there because you really like to go shopping, and you could learn how to sew and make your own shirts, and constantly be exposing them to things. If they show no interest, I'm not going to force it. I don't want to push them down a path that is not theirs to travel. But I'm going to be very involved in identifying opportunities for them and suggesting to them what they can do. I think the apprentice model is huge. It's a very low barrier of entry, very low commitment. So if a child does an apprenticeship and 2 weeks in they're like, this is not for me, they can get out of it, no hassle, and no major investment that they've lost. They can just move on to the next thing. When I was 15, I got a part-time job in a law firm through a connection my mom had, and it's what helped me decide I did not want to become a lawyer, which is kind of funny because I now work with the law, but more in an advocacy and research role rather than as an attorney, pushing papers and billing people. I just saw no joy in the office type of work that they did, and at least in that type of law that they practice. So I think exposure is key, and that's where parents can be a huge help, not in saying, hey, you're going to learn X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to make you do all this stuff. But parents, as adults, they know they have great communities, especially with social networking. Tap into that. Leverage it for the benefit of your child, and expose them to all sorts of different things, even just like single-day job shadowing opportunities, so that these children are getting exposed much more than their government school peers will. I think that exposure is huge in helping children kind of figure out what they want to do with their lives, because most teenagers, haven't yet got to the point, as I didn't at that age, to really understand what their life's path would be. So I think exposure is key, and I think that's a primary benefit that parents can provide to their, especially teenage children.
That's great. That's some very helpful insight for parents, I think, that want to make sure that their kids have those opportunities. Do you see where the public schools could implement passion-driven education in some measure, where these types of concepts could be done within the very structured walls of compulsory education schools? How could that possibly come about?
I think there's two types of structure in schools. One is content structure, and the other is more of the logistical variety. So, obviously schools have regulated rules, and you get like 50 minutes in each period, and you have to take all these required courses. That's one type of structure. The other type of structure is like for the standards and the curriculum, the content itself. I think the challenge that we have, especially in America and especially in Utah, is that not only is the system itself structured, which is understandable given the system the way it is, but that the content is so structured. I spoke just the other day to 150 different charter school teachers at their annual conference. I gave the keynote address on this very topic, and I said, I shared a story. I share this story actually in the book as well, of a teacher in Mexico who one day, being inspired by an educational experiment he came across and read about, he went to class, he set aside the standards, set aside his lesson plan, sat down in front of his children, and asked them, what do you guys want to learn? And that simple question flipped the process on its head. And the children asked questions, and he taught them, and he followed the path that they would help figure out, to the point that, at least based on the Mexican standards and assessments, that school, his class, got the top scores in the entire country. And so I shared that story with these charter school teachers here in Utah, and I asked them, I said, when was the last time you asked your students what they wanted to learn? And then I followed that up by asking, are you even allowed to ask that question?
Yeah.
Right? We've become so highly regimented I know good teachers who feel shackled. They want to do something like this. They want to appeal to children's interests and customize things, but they're hampered in doing so. Not entirely, and some teachers will kind of buck the system and close the door so the administrators don't see, and they'll use these approaches anyways. I think a great example of what I'm talking about, passion-driven education being done in the classroom, is examples I've read online of teachers around the country who will use things like Minecraft, right? Very, very popular software for kids. You're building entire worlds and such. And these teachers will use Minecraft in the classroom to teach their lessons. And they sing praises, these teachers, of the engagement of children and their interest level being increased and the absorption or retention of that information being greater. Imagine if you did that right now with Pokemon Go, right? With how much of a fad that is. Like,
right.
If you had the freedom as a teacher to experiment and innovate in this way, you could do it. So I think it's very limited in school. I don't think it's impossible, but I think the system is built up to disallow this type of approach, which is why, as I explain in the book, ultimately you're going to be probably doing a more homeschool variety of education with your child if you really want to embrace this methodology.
Well, thank you, Connor. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. My name's Oak Norton. For those of you just forgotten, I'm the Director of Agency-Based Education. I've been talking with Connor Boyack, author of Passion-Driven Education. It's a new book available on Amazon, How to Use Your Child's Interest to Ignite a Lifelong Love of Learning. Connor, do you have a website for your book specifically?
Yeah, it's just passion-driveneducation.com.
Excellent. I'll be posting this podcast on our website, and that's agencybasededucation.org for those that pick up this podcast somewhere else. And I hope you've enjoyed listening. Thank you very much, Connor.
Thanks, Oak.